Since Parkland, we've seen a variety of organizations come up, and I'd like to know what inspired you to start Orange Ribbons for Jamie.
So the day that Jamie was killed, Jamie was the first publicly identified victim. A friend of mine was a police officer on the scene, and he found her. So we knew before 6 p.m. that night what happened. And when the message got out to the dance studio that she danced at, her dance sisters went into action. They knew Jamie's favorite color was orange. So they all got together and started making thousands of orange ribbons. They took a picture in our house wearing their orange ribbons. It went viral in 24 hours through the dance world. A few weeks later, I was wearing my orange ribbon, as I always did every day, and somebody said to me, "Do you know orange is the color of the gun safety movement?" The coincidence, the connection was too much to ignore. And so I started Orange Ribbons for Jamie. It's basically two purposes or two missions. One is to honor those things that were important to Jamie in life. Dance was Jamie's life. So we've connected with an entity in Massachusetts called Jacob's Pillow. It's a national dance company, and we provide dance scholarships now to Jacob's Pillow. My daughter was dog obsessed. Didn't matter if they were someone else's dogs or our dogs. She loved dogs. So we've given money back to the Humane Society. My daughter also knew at the age of 14 what she wanted to do when she grew up. She knew she wanted to be a pediatric physical therapist. It was her dream to help a kid walk for the first time. So the Paley Institute brings in families from around the world. Not all of them have money. So that's the other place that we've given money back to as well. The other mission is to deal with what happened to Jamie, the issue of gun violence. We now have an epidemic. 40,000 people per year die from gun violence. In the time that we do this interview, somebody will be getting the news that their family is the latest to be affected by gun violence. Somebody will be burying a victim of gun violence, and somebody will be planning a funeral for a victim of gun violence. Our role is to do something about that.
What goals does the organization hope to achieve short-term and long-term?
My goal is to ensure our legislators, whether they be local or national, are educated on the facts. And my goal is to make sure that if they don't do their job, that we all help to fire them. Now that we have a House that is in place because of this issue, I expect them to act. I expect this House not just to talk about this stuff, but to schedule and take votes. And we might actually get legislation passed. Long term, I expect this issue to be a dominant issue in the next election. So next year, I see myself advocating for common sense policies around gun safety. This year, it's to make sure those legislators that we brought in take that role seriously, because if not, we'll send them home as well.
You said you didn't like to use the term gun control, but rather gun safety, and you can explain why that is. Yep. But what are some of the gun safety policies that you would like to see implemented to reduce the amount of violence in America?
Yeah, and the thing on gun control, there is no control. Nobody's looking to control anybody or anything. The purpose of gun safety is not to take anybody's weapons away if you're a legal, lawful gun owner, or put some burden on you. It's to keep those who intend to kill away from weapons. Number one, background checks. We've got to fix the system in this country. It's broken. It's full of loopholes. And that's what the current bill up for debate will do. We got to raise the age to 21. Safe storage. Adults who don't lock up their weapons and that weapon then gets used in a crime, that adult should be held liable. We need to ban bump stocks. What the president did to eliminate bump stocks was just a rule change. I'm thankful that he did it, but he could change his mind tomorrow, or another president could change. So we need legislation to put it into law. We need to ban high-capacity magazines. We need to allow the CDC to study this public epidemic, and we need to fund it and allow them to make recommendations. We need to undo a federal law known as PLCA, which makes it illegal for victims of gun violence to sue the retailers or manufacturers that were involved in the weapon that was used in that crime. If we want to change the gun culture in this country, start making gun manufacturers and retailers responsible, and we'll get them to start self-policing.
What kind of social impact has your organization had since it's been established? I know that recently the Universal movie was going to be put out on Valentine's Day, but instead they pushed it back because you spoke up. And I think it's a testimony to how strong these organizations have become after the shooting.
And that movie was called Happy Death Day to You, which for me, February 14th is going to always be Death Day. And so I was horrified when I heard about it. I think the social power is enormous. And I think all of you kids understood that way more than all of us adults. In fact, when my daughter was killed, I wasn't even on Twitter. I started putting out all these rambling things on Facebook. And my sister, I think it was the end of February, beginning of March, said, you really ought to get on Twitter and figure out how to use that. And so I did. And I'm now at, I think I have 160,000 followers on Twitter. And I don't say it to brag. I say it because I did hit a nerve with what I was saying and doing. And having that number of followers has real social impact. There was what happened last week in the hearing with Congressman Matt Gaetz, who stood up and rambled on about the nonsense of undocumented immigrants being behind all the shootings in this country, and that the only way to stop it is to build a southern wall. I was sitting next to my friend Manny Oliver, who in the same shooting lost his son. Manny is a guy who escaped Venezuela 15 years ago to protect his family, to escape violence. And he is an American citizen now. And his son was killed by an American male. I think that congressman realized that you can't say things like that and get away with it anymore because we're gonna come after you. In this world of social media and social power, these moments become massive stories. And that is because of social media. And using it to drive your message is certainly something that I've been figuring out over the past year. Fortunately, we've been successful because we've managed to keep this messaging around gun violence at the forefront. You know, it didn't go away, and it's not going to go away this time.
So how do you think that movements like the one that we're experiencing now after the Parkland shooting, how do you think that they can improve to expedite those goals?
You know, one way would be to try and not splinter off into too many divergent groups. What happens after events like this, you get a load of groups that are all trying to do the same thing, and they split messaging and they split dollars, even though they're trying to accomplish the same end goal. I get why it happens, but you know, I think of the gun lobby, and one of the reasons why they have such a powerful message is there's really one group that is the main messaging force, even though there's multiple groups within the gun lobby, and they work together to ensure that stays that way. So I do think, you know, there is certainly more power when people stay together. And in fairness, I started my own, you know, and I did so because for me, my organization was about Jamie. I do actually partner with all of the other groups, or I try to. I think it would be more successful if those bigger groups could be more aligned.
After the president's State of the Union address, how confident are you in those changes being made in terms of gun safety policies?
So, more so than I've ever been, but not because of the president. In that room that night, you had victims of gun violence that were invited by congressmen and senators, Republicans and Democrats from across the country. There were a lot. It's never happened before. I was there as a guest of Speaker Pelosi. Okay, that's never happened before for gun violence, gun safety messaging to get to that place. So gun safety messaging had a prominent role at the State of the Union. You never would have known it based upon the president's messaging, but it did. And I'm optimistic because this House is going to push this to law. They are going to pass bills. They are going to put things through the House of Representatives, and the Senate will either take it up or they will pay a price when we all vote in 2 years. The president let me down. He had an opportunity to say more. He tried to do something with what happened in Pittsburgh. He brought people from Pittsburgh who were victims. He talked about their heroism, but he never talked about what actually happened in Pittsburgh. He never talked about the gun. He never talked about the fact that somebody walked into a temple with an AR-15 and massacred people. When he talked about gun violence, he only did it when talking about the southern border. And he made up numbers and statistics that aren't based in reality. I actually wrote an op-ed for Newsweek the next day because I was so frustrated. And I said, had my daughter been killed by an undocumented immigrant, I would have been one of the president's guests that night. He would have invited me. But my daughter wasn't. She was killed by an American male, which is the way it typically is. He politicized gun violence, but he didn't do anything constructive. So he disappointed me, but he almost became irrelevant to the process going forward because it's going to keep on moving forward. You have this House now that's going to do it. The states are going to keep doing it. And people who don't, they'll be fired.
And for my last question, having experienced what you've experienced and knowing what you know now, what can you say to parents that have experienced what you've gone through?
We all grieve differently. Find your path for you. It's probably one of the best pieces of advice that I was given early on, and actually it came from Vice President Joe Biden, talking to me about grief and how everybody grieves differently, and not to look at the way other people grieve or the things that they do, but to find that space that helps you get through the days. And it was so true. We all have different moments and different needs. And I just think, people hear the word grief and grieving, and there's no textbook cookie cutter way that says, at this point in time, you will be feeling this emotion. And if you go through this much time, you'll be feeling better, because it doesn't work that way. And I remember back to when my daughter was killed, how many people said to me, give it time, it'll get easier. It doesn't. I miss my kid more every day. And maybe for others it will, and that's fine. But for me, I can't stop thinking about what I am missing with her every single day. Grief is a really weird thing. And it can hit you at unexpected and really weird moments. I always tell the story. It was back in March. My daughter did this thing with my phone. She put in my calendar on random days throughout the year, this thing called Love Jamie Day. A few weeks after she was killed, I was in DC, and Love Jamie Day popped up. You talk about grief, I almost couldn't get through my day. There are days where you're going to feel like you're okay, and there are going to be days where you feel like you just can't get going. The advice I would give to people is to understand that and to get help with it. Don't try to do it yourself.